This episode of the podcast features a social scientist who specializes in authoritarian populism, refugee and immigration, social networks in political extremism, and drivers of polarization. What does this have to do with sustainability? Quite a bit. Miriam's work caught my attention when she was presenting a study about public opinion on the topic of navigating uncertainty. I was intrigued by the study because it compares 6 European countries and also examined climate change and how it was viewed differently. In conversation with Miriam, I soon realized it was important to include her other expertise area and hear what she had to say about sustainability from a larger political and social perspective. Join us in the rabbit hole. Sustainability at Work is a podcast about sustainability in the workplace and in companies. My name is Samara and I've been working with sustainability for almost 10 years. Hello, welcome everybody to Sustainability at Work. Thank you so much, Miriam, for being here.
Thanks a lot. A pleasure to be here.
Welcome. I'm very happy. I think it's really gold to have you here because we have a lot to talk about and we need a social scientist to know how to connect many things. And I think also this episode, even if it goes a little bit outside of sustainability, strictly speaking, I think it's very useful to have a bigger picture of the many challenges that we have. So I'm going to go right into it and let's start with more in common because then we're going to talk about the study, but I wanted to know a little bit about the goals and where it's born, if you can start from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. More in Common is an international initiative organization. It's not that old. It's about almost 5 years old. So it depends on how you're counting. It was born in 2017 out of mainly two events. On the one hand, the refugee and migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, because we did see a void in public opinion and understand how public opinion was being formed, how we could create a space for different kind of political leadership as well, based on the understanding of where the public is at. And also as a result of the atrocious murder of the MP Joe Cox in the UK, which was at the hands of a white supremacist that was against Brexit and against welcoming refugees as well. So More in Common started looking at a lot of these issues in connection to one another in a very systemic way. The organization has evolved. The mission of the organization is now fighting the forces of polarization and division to create more united and resilient societies to those forces. And within that, we also look at different issues. And we've been looking a lot at climate change as well, but not as a silo issue, but actually how it connects to other things, how opinions are formed, and always integrating social psychology as a lens that we apply. So trying to understand how people also form their political and moral judgment and how it connects to a variety of issues in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And so this latest study that I saw the other day and I was very interested in, it's called Navigating Uncertainty. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what was the period in which you did this and the countries? And I think it's very interesting because it's a study that was done on 6 countries, so you can see the differences and of the different topics.
It's actually a live project. It's a 1-year-long project, and what we've published so far is only the results of the first phase. So this project was not originally called Navigating Uncertainty. It didn't really have a proper title. But it is a project that we conceived to actually explore where the public is at 2 years after the pandemic. Understanding what are the rifts, divisions existing in our societies, what the impacts of the pandemic have been on people's sense of solidarity, of social cohesion. We have data that precedes this study for most of the countries as well, so we're able to see the shifts, whether there are new divisions that are being caused, but also how all of these intersects with other topics as well. So, for example, climate regulation of social media platforms, or in some of the countries also, for example, migration. Part of the project has different sides of it. So More in Common is not a think tank. It's an organization that does research and collects evidence to put it to the service of other organizations, to use it in communications, in political advocacy. So the project does have those components. But when it comes to the research, the first stage consisted of a survey and some qualitative work. In terms of the survey, some of it is comparative. So we do have data for all of the countries, but then we also have some questions that are specific to each of the countries. So for example, in Spain, we collected a lot of data on migration, which we haven't done in other places. And maybe in the UK, we focused a little bit more from the outset on cost of living or other topics that were relevant, or maybe more policy oriented. Recognizing that when it comes to climate, for example, the 6 countries that are included, which are the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland, are at very different places in terms of awareness, public opinion, and so on. So we also wanted to make sure we reflected that on the study.
Mm-hmm. So if we want to share a big picture of Europe, where do we stand? Without differences, how on average do we stand? What are the main challenges? What are the main problems?
The title became Navigating Uncertainty because that really is what came out of the data, that strong sense of we don't know where we're at, we don't know where we're going, we don't know if the worst has passed or is yet to come, which at the time in which the data was collected, which was early this year or later last year, the war in Ukraine hadn't erupted yet. And there was already this sense of uncertainty, of doubt. And I would say that probably that's still very much the case. This has just confirmed and strengthened those sensations. And we are doing poll work and other efforts as well. So we do collect data. So definitely that sensation or feeling of uncertainty. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic how there was an increase in feelings of solidarity and of social cohesion. So there was that moment that it's usually identified in other crises as well as a honeymoon phase of unity. Unfortunately, what we're seeing through Navigating Uncertainty is that has severely diminished and almost evaporated in a lot of places. So perception of division has increased by 40% in France, for percentage points in France, which is a huge proportional change, a huge percentage change. But it's also that perception of division has increased a lot in a lot of the other countries as well. We are also seeing a landscape of suspicion. So in some of the countries, we see that there are significant percentages of the public who also believe that the truth about the pandemic, for example, of COVID, has been hidden. It's 50% in Spain. I think it's higher in Poland and some of the other countries as well. And this is not to focus on the pandemic. It's more to underscore that this is the climate we are operating in. So if you're someone that's concerned about migration, if you're someone who's concerned about climate change, if you're someone who's concerned about sustainability, and you're working on campaigns or designing a policy, this is a psychological landscape of the people of these European countries, right? So there's a sensation of uncertainty, there's some sense of suspicion, and very little appetite for personal change. And then depending on the country, some appetite for more societal change. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing. These are the negative ones. We also see some things that are quite promising. And More in Common has been doing a lot of work on climate because we've seen the opportunities that exist in this space. Climate change is obviously the biggest crisis that humanity is facing. And in many of these societies where we're seeing an increasing polarization, or at least this perceived sense of division, of what we call also political tribalism, what we are observing is that the climate issue is not yet, at least not yet, polarized. It's still not as tied to political identities. So that's promising on the one hand, but also everything else tells us that we need to be cautious, that there could be backlash, that it can become a polarized issue. that then increases the stalemate or makes progress even more challenging. So knowing knowing the context in we are operating, we're also trying to marry this and then see how we can move forward. We know that most Europeans want more action on climate, that this is something that they're worried about, that despite the pandemic, it's been a top issue in most of the countries that we've explored, that the pandemic has also made more evident that sometimes changes are possible. So we did see an increase in the air quality that resulted in people saying, oh, okay, maybe there's something that we can do about this. There are some positive trends on that as well on increased awareness on mental health issues in some sectors of society, and, for example, on regulation of social media.
I have a question about that. So what makes a topic polarized? Is it the narrative used in politics? What happens that destroys the possibility of that topic to be more transversal, more open?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. So the first thing to note is that not any sort of disagreement equals polarization. Disagreements are natural, are a normal part of living in a democratic society, and probably even necessary. That being said, we talk about polarization. There's two types of polarization that we talk about. One is issue-based polarization, and the other one is affective polarization. Issue-based polarization is when on a particular topic, there are two poles of opinion that are diametrically opposed. That can happen in just one issue in society, it can happen in a few, but sometimes what happens is something we call conflict extension, which is that identity groups are formed which aligned on all of the topics. And these often, the example of the US is often used to describe this, right? For some identity groups, usually, if you know what they think about gun control, you know what they think about abortion, you know what they think about climate change, you know what they think about an array of issues. And those identities become even more and more entrenched. In the UK, for example, we are in a very different landscape, and we don't talk about issue polarization because there are consensus on a lot of topics. But then also what we see is that depending on the topic, the groups that form alliances or that agree are different. It's a little bit like a kaleidoscope that you can, roll and then it will change in the colors and the alliances. Then we talk about affective polarization, which is the most dangerous one. It's also when identity groups are formed, and we talk about in-group and out-group dynamics. We view our group very favorably and the other group very, very badly. We attribute bad goals, bad motives, and we end up almost creating a caricature of the other group that in the worst case scenarios can lead to political violence because the other group is dehumanized. This happens when this tribalism is strengthened. We are all humans who have embedded in us the need to belong to a group. And belonging to a group is not necessarily a bad thing or necessarily an exclusionary thing, but it can become exclusionary. Some groups can become exclusionary. So it could well be the case that on climate change, it becomes very polarized where there's diametrically opposed views in the topic, or it could become something that's also tied to identities. So, for example, something that I like to say is that the Spanish data is pointing to the fact that people perceive the left-right divide or the divisions between people who describe themselves as left and right-wing as the most important one in society. But when we explore issues of climate, very exceptionally, we don't see those patterns necessarily of left and right. There are some trends, but most voters have sympathy towards the topic of climate, which is a good thing. What would happen if we tie climate issues, if we tie protecting the countryside, protecting nature to just a left-wing identity? That would mean that by default, people that are right-wing would oppose it. And the other way around, right? If we had that effective polarization, it would matter more who says something than what is actually being said. So that would be the danger with polarization, which can be used as a strategy, a very effective one, and dangerous one as well.
Last question. I don't want to go maybe deeper too much in this, but I think it's interesting. who is responsible to polarize so much topic? I mean, if we want to avoid it, for example, for climate change, who should be careful about that? It's more the press, it's more politician, it's more a generic thing of society.
Different actors can polarize. We talk about political entrepreneurs when someone decides to polarize. And let's be clear, polarization is a very effective mobilizing strategy. You appeal to people's sense of identity, you activate emotions, you play into fears and concerns. So it can well be that it's the political elite that are polarizing. It can also be activists. It's harder if we think about a citizen alone, but it could be the case that a personality, a celebrity, also has the power to polarize. We think about polarization and a strategy that can be used in different ways. So sometimes it's as a strategy for the goal of retaining power. So it's a bit of like status quo polarization. And that happens sometimes when polarization is used by mainstream parties. We can also think about polarization as it relates to transformative politics. And it could be exclusionary transformative politics or inclusive transformative politics. So we could think about some social justice movements whose goal is to achieve greater equality that could opt for a polarizing strategy. The problem is that polarization can get out of control and become a phenomenon of its own. Or we can think of exclusionary transformative politics, which, for example, aims to define a particular nation state that excludes everyone else. And we see it in authoritarian populists across Europe that are trying to build that in-group that leaves others behind, and who are also trying, in some respects, to polarize climate issues too, but not everywhere.
And I guess everything is made much worse by social media because of how they work and the algorithm and everything. Can you tell us a little bit about the study and what comes out about social media and the challenges and the fear maybe of how social media are polarizing society or not?
Yes, so this is not part of Navigating Uncertainty, but we have other work and we do have other data that speaks to the role of social media. And what the social media does is that it amplifies and elevates the voices of those who are most polarized. So what we know as well is that when we talk about social media, often we talk about specific platforms. We also know that most of the people who are on those platforms and are very politically active are a very small percentage of the population, but they are the most politically active and engaged. So we misrepresent what the public thinks when we focus on social media. So on the one hand, there's that element of elevating the most polarized voices, which then get amplified in traditional media and also the conversation that we see online. Then obviously there's still a lot that's not known about how the algorithm functions. We know that the algorithms have gone through a trajectory from just showing what you like the most to creating outrage, because outrage generates more engagement. But I really like the work of a scholar called Molly Crockett. She's a social psychologist, and she reflects on this idea of moral outrage and social media as well. Because when you're constantly outraged, what does that do to you, right? And it could be that you are just constantly anxious and more willing as well to participate in an angry manner in public conversation. It could also well be the case that you become desensitized to very appalling things. And I think that's also something that we've experienced over the past few years. So social media for sure contributes in different ways to polarization. A lot of the mechanisms are unknown, and I think that it's important to keep a systemic view of this and not reduce it to just one variable. We also know that there's, besides the fact that policymakers, legislators, the general public don't know a lot about how these platforms operate, there's also not a lot of awareness on a lot of these issues. But we do see that there's an increased interest in the European countries that we studied through Navigating Uncertainty of regulating certain things. Something that's been interesting in this study as well is that we don't see a lot of intergenerational differences. However, when it comes to social media, it is true that we see that young people are more worried about the mental health impacts of social media and are interested in this being something that's addressed by governments. So there's that awareness in this group, and that I think they also feel it personally, that it has a greater impact on their mental health or some impact in their mental health.
Before going back to sustainability a little bit, that was one of my questions. What is happening with the young generation? That was something that really surprised me, how the problem of mental health came out, especially in that generation. Is it related only to COVID? Is it more on the problem with the job market?
It's interesting because if we look at the data and we ask whether you're feeling anxious, whether you're feeling lonely, it's true that the data is worse for youth. And it probably is related to different things depending on the country. It's probably not the same in the UK that for Spain, Spaniards or Italians. In Spain, for example, we do see how, and Spain and Italy, how this mental health data that we have, it's self-reported, like how anxious you feel, how lonely you feel, it's worse for the young population. They're also less likely to feel happy, for example, or hopeful. It likely relates a lot to the job situation, not just unemployment, but also the precariousness of the job market. And this is something that's come up a lot in our focus groups and our discussions with younger people. So that's definitely a component of it. There might be an element of it as well, obviously, that your 20s can be hard. So there might be something that's moderated there that shifts a little bit with age, for sure. And I think that there's also an element of awareness. I think young people have a better vocabulary and a better awareness and less stigma attached to mental health issues. So I think that those conversations are probably more lively amongst younger people than maybe the eldest in our society.
I was wondering if regarding this, something came out about their sense of not having agency. And I'm going back to climate change, and many times how the youth movement is much more active in trying to push for quicker change, bigger changes in sustainability and climate change. I don't know if you have any data.
We do have some data on agency, not particularly in this study, but something that was very interesting of research that we did in late 2020 was a greater sense of agency as a result of the improvements that we saw on air pollution, as I was saying, and other aspects that were very palpable as a result of lockdowns. So that increased the sense in the UK, for example, and it's probably true in other places, that maybe actually we do have power over what's going on. Mm-hmm. That being said, one of the things that surprised me about navigating uncertainty results was that when it came to concern about climate change, it was almost equal among all age groups, but a little bit higher amongst the oldest society. So I think that we tend to have this idea that it's actually the youth that are more mobilized or concerned about this. And I think that to a certain degree, that's true. So the most mobilized, the most active are probably young. But if we look at the population as a whole, the concern is spread across age groups, and the eldest amongst us are actually quite worried about this topic as well. Climate change, issues related to the environment and nature are prominent or salient in some of the countries and less so in others. We do see that they tend to be displaced by economic difficulties. So, for example, in Spain, it's not a prominent issue. It's amongst the top 6 in Italy, but not at the top either. And I think that because it affects young people so much, we were seeing in Spain, for example, in the focus groups, how the young people would tell us, yes, this is something we worry about. We know this is important, but at the end of the day, we are focused on getting a job or being able to pay rent or in the more immediate needs. Whereas maybe the eldest population actually had more free time, or they didn't have to worry so much about their job opportunities in the future because they're already in the market or they had long careers behind them already. So that moderated a little bit what we've been seeing in some of the countries.
Do you have any insight about how what leverage to use in each of these countries when talking about sustainability. I particularly like the other day when you talked about Spain and how maybe if you work in sustainability, you should focus on energy. In the case of Spain, sustainability means a lot of different things in different places and different industries too. So maybe in one place it makes more sense to talk about climate change, or you were saying it makes more sense to use a scientist that speaks instead of some other or a businessman. Do you have any insight about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that understanding the specific context of each of the countries or of the places in which you're operating is absolutely important. It's important as well to understand the audience that you're talking to. So More in Common does audience segmentations based on psychographic profiles. We see in climate, for example, that as I was saying, actually age is not necessarily the most predictive. So if you are trying to talk to a specific audience, maybe it's better to think about where they're at and how do you meet them there. So if we know that if we are in a context where there's a lot of uncertainty and where there's a lot of fear, or that particular group feels that way, maybe you shouldn't be talking about sustainability, about connected to the end of the world, because what you're going to do is you're just going to scare that people, right? So you need to connect to where they're at and take them on a journey rather than maybe speak from like you personally come from. There's a variety of things. On the one hand, first of all, understanding how salient or prominent that issue is for someone. So it might be that that particular group is already mobilized around climate change resonates with those ideas, then maybe it's the way to go about it. We know, as you were mentioning in Spain, that it's not one of the most prominent issues. But we do know that cost of living, that the price of energy are very prominent issues. So maybe we can connect it to the issues that people already care about. So that might be another strategy as well. In a time of increased uncertainty or perceived threat, maybe I understand the urgency of talking about climate change as a crisis, but if it's seen as an unsurmountable issue, what we might do might actually be deactivate or alienate. So that's also relevant as well, like be cautious about the language that we're using it and how we're tying to other issues. We've explored views as well on whether, for example, the green transition will actually increase the amount of jobs. And we've asked the question of whether it will create employment or will reduce the amount of jobs in 4 countries. And we've seen in 2 of the countries that a lot of the people, or the majority of people, say actually the green transition might increase the number of jobs. So we see that, for example, in Spain, we see it in France. In the other 2 countries, Poland and Italy, we gave the respondents the option of answering don't know. And I think it was about 40% of the people said don't know, which first of all tells us that there's still a lot that's unknown and it can be a very technical issue. So understandably, people will say, actually, I'm not equipped to answer this question. What's interesting is that when the don't know is not there, we saw in the other countries that people lean optimist. I think that's good news because people want to hang on to something in this time of uncertainty and people want to be optimist on this topic. So we can capitalize on this optimism rather than maybe throw water into the fire, because then we could actually demobilize. And then building on what's already there, on the behaviors that are already being adopted. I'm probably not being extremely specific because, as I was saying, I think it depends on the context, on the audience, on the country. But these are things that we've been seeing across the countries where we operate that seem to be more effective at connecting with people on matters of climate change and of sustainability.
On a bigger picture, what do you think it's important? I mean, with the study you do and also with your experience, really, you can connect a lot of things. What do you think it's more important? What are our best tools to create that climate action, but not only social action that we need in the next year? What do we need to connect and strengthen?
There's an element of what we need to do and an element of what we shouldn't be doing. Okay. So as I was saying, this is a topic that could become polarized. And I think that if we talk about the threats to our fight against climate change and the obstacles to improve sustainability, there's a few things that are relevant. One is that it becomes another identity issue. It becomes another culture war. So we should not tie it to a political identity. We should make it as a common threat, a common project. We should approach it with the whole of society idea to it, which in a way is already how a lot of people are thinking. So we do see that while people will say yes, big oil companies and corporations and governments are most responsible, we are all responsible. All actors of society should be invested in this. Using a whole of society approach and not tying to political identities, I think, will be very important. Another aspect of it will be managing the costs. So inevitably, there's going to be people that lose out of the transition and that lose out of because of climate change. So we know that that's inevitable. We need to present the options in a positive way, but at the same time acknowledging the cost and considering compensations. Because otherwise, it can create backlash. There's going to be people that are going to be resentful. So it's necessary to take all of that into account in a realistic way. We already know that in the countries where we've studied, between 20 and 40% of the people feel like losers of social change. That can mean different things, but we do know that there are significant percentage that have this sensation. So we need to learn how to navigate all of that and compensate for the losses. I think you've already pointed as well as the idea of agency. So I think increasing or empowering people, showing where change is possible, bringing it to the local as much as possible, to what's palpable or nearby, is likely to be more effective as well. And then maybe not disempowering when people are trying to do things. So I think a conversation we're having as well is around recycling, and how some of the discourse right now is that it's not enough, and that's what's perceived. We've done a lot of focus groups in the UK, and like there's this idea that first they tell us to get hybrid cars, and now they tell us that no, and then we have to install this boiler, and then they'll tell us another one. And first they tell us we need to recycle. We all get on board of recycle, and now they're telling us that it's not enough. Rather than saying maybe it's not enough, it would be more of like saying it's great that you're doing this. Why don't you also do this? And we build on that, so that it's something that you can be proud of, and it can become part of like something that makes you feel a good citizen and a good person.
Mm-hmm. I really like your suggestion, but I do have something that is there. So if I want to summarize a little bit, let's say that polarization is the biggest threat that we might have, and the most positive and hopeful tool that we do have is action through different groups. Can we identify some groups? Are we hopeful more on young people, more on scientists? Where should we put our hope on?
Trying to see who the right messenger is also of utmost importance. And sometimes the most trusted agent is not going to be someone from a large corporation. It's not going to be someone from an NGO. It tends to be someone that looks like the person you're trying to appeal to. We do see that in some countries, for example, it is the scientific community or healthcare providers. So maybe there's different actors that we can tap into. And that for sure is also an element to be conscious of.
Yeah, I remember we had a great episode with it's a network of advertising agency. They work together to create awareness on climate change, and they created this campaign about mom in science. So they're using scientist mom to communicate climate change to other moms, and it was very, very, very effective in the US. Last question. Is it possible to be an optimist in your line of work? You're working with everything that our society is trying to avoid, like polarization, conflicts. Is it possible to be hopeful and positive? What do you use to recharge?
I was looking at that question when you sent it to me, and I was trying to reflect on how to answer to this. Although I had the immediate answer at the tip of my tongue from the beginning, I think it's an imperative to be. I think we need to be optimistic with a healthy dose of cynicism. So my natural inclination might be one for maybe a bit of more pessimist outlook. And of course, we looked at the data, we look at the state of the world and what's happening, and it can be very overwhelming. But at the end of the day, we do have the ability to make a choice. And if we don't make the choice to be optimistic, then we're already losing. I'm a yoga practitioner, so that really informs the way that I view the world. And my need to be an optimist, and my conviction that we should try, but not in a naive way. We need to also recognize the struggles.
I saw that you are a lot into yoga, and I thought that this could be one of the answers. But I also saw another one, which I in another interview maybe that you gave, and I thought it was very interesting. You talk about the optimism that it gives you, your experience of living in different countries and found home in all of them, and found that you were welcomed in all of them. And I thought that was also another beautiful answer.
Yeah, I acknowledge the privilege that I have. I was born and raised in Barcelona, which is a very, very beautiful place. And I was very fortunate to get a fellowship to study in the US. I spent some time in Colombia. I lived in Ghana and in the UK. And all places come with a struggle. But at the end of the day as well, I think that personal connection really goes very far. And when you find love in many of its forms, it's hard not to be an optimist or try to be for those you care about. And I found love in all of those places, and then they became home. I of course recognize all of the privilege and fortune that I've had. So that's part of it as well. I also have a pessimist in me, I'm not gonna lie, and I think that's my natural inclination. In fact, it's something that I fight against. But then I try to be grateful for everything that I have and all that we have as well. And I look up to my grandmothers a lot. They're probably the most important figures in my life and very inspiring. They've probably have not had the regular trajectory that would lead to admiration. They were born and raised and grew up in a dictatorship. They were stay-at-home moms. They nurtured beautiful families, and they're full of love. So I look up to them. But I also see how they weren't allowed to go to university. They could not get a passport without the permission of their father or the husband. They couldn't do all of these things that to me have been available and I've been able to work towards. So in the grand scheme of things, a lot of things have got better, and progress is not linear. So we need to build toward greater belonging, and we can only do that through optimism as well.
That's why I loved so much that answer, because I think it goes back to trying to remember that we are a big community, influencing each other and trying to take out these walls that we build sometimes. So I think this is a beautiful way to end our interview. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing everything. We will post the link to the study in the show notes. So check it out. And thank you so much, Miriam.